So welcome, everybody. Uh, this is our February webinar on configuration management and config split. Our presenter will be John Picozzi. So let me start. Let me resume my share. So before we begin, some housekeeping. Most of you are probably familiar about Drupal for Gov, but we are a community of open source advocates. So we love everything that's open source. So in addition to this webinar that we hold on a monthly basis every third Thursday, we also have our big conference that's held in the summer. This year, it'll be July 27th through the 30th. We also do global training days, but due to the pandemic, we haven't done much of that, but stay tuned, I guess. So hopefully sometime in the future, we'll start that again. And also we do the Gov Summit at DrupalCon in North America. If you have any questions or concerns, or you are interested in presenting for a particular webinar, feel free to reach out to us, send us an email using the Drupal for Gov email address. And we also have a Slack channel, and we are on Twitter. And if you miss a session, we immediately after each webinar, we upload them to YouTube. And we also have a page on our drupalforgov.us website where you can view upcoming and even past webinars and links to the videos. Our next webinar will be on Dev Panel and DevOps with AWS. So that is a good topic, and I know a lot of Drupal sites are running within AWS. So please mark your calendar, March 3rd Thursday. And last but not least, our speaker, as I mentioned before, is John Picozzi. He is an account manager at He was a senior Drupal architect. He co-organizes is it a Drupal camp at Providence, Rhode Island, and the New England Drupal camp? I may have typed that.
It's a meetup and a Drupal camp.
Okay. And he's also the co-host of Talking Drupal podcast. So now I'm going to hand off control to you.
All right. So before I jump into my slides, or while I'm getting my slides here, just using the reactions button here in Zoom, can I see how many people are using configuration management or kind of getting into configuration management, as far as maybe you're new to it, trying to get it. If you give me a thumbs up if you're, or hand raise, let's do a hand raise if you're using it currently, or thumbs up if you're gonna start using it. All right, they're coming in. I can see them now. Perfect. So the way this training is going to progress, I'm going to go through hopefully about half an hour, 45 minutes of a slide deck. And it's just going to give you an overview of configuration management, and then get into an overview of config split, how that works, some useful modules that you might want to try to install with config management. And then we're going to get into the live demo portion of our show. And we're basically going to start from nothing and install config management or enable configuration management in Drupal, show you what core does out of the box, and then we're going to layer on top of that config split, and then configure that to show you how that works. So we have 2 hours. I think we will be able to fit all of that stuff into that time. At any point, if anybody has a question, I do have the chat open, so I can kind of take a look in there. And you guys also have, most of you should have microphones, so feel free to, if you have a question, jump in, but I will make sure that I stop every so often and ask them if there are questions. So Everybody should be able to see my slides, hopefully. Is that accurate? Nobody's screaming no, so
Yep.
yes. Okay, cool. So basically, as I said, we're going to do a overview of config management and then some helpful tips and tricks as to how you can kind of navigate the config management realm in Drupal. This talk was originally given a couple of years ago at DrupalCon. It was co-presented with Nate Denzow, who is currently the co-owner of Mythic Digital. So he had some insight in here, and yeah, it was a great presentation. Look it up.
Someone asked what version of config split should be installed for this demonstration.
So this is actually, my demo is using Drupal 9, but this will apply to Drupal 8 as well. Not much has changed with what I'm showing today between the two versions. So more about me. Again, my name is John Picozzi. I'm an account manager at Oomph, Providence-based digital strategy agency. And as said, I know you guys are like, what is an account manager doing teaching us about config management? Well, before I was an account manager, I was a senior Drupal architect. And before that, I was a site builder and developer. So I have a ton of experience. Also, a little bit about Oomph. As I said, we're a full service digital agency. We're helping companies with digital strategy, user experience design, and digital implementation. Our clients include Blue Cross Blue Shield, Brown University, Rhode Island School of Design, and the American Veterinary Association. Also, if anybody in there is looking for, in the chat room there is looking for a job, we are hiring. So feel free to go to our website, oomphinc.com, and check out the careers page. So enough about me. Let's get to the main topic here. And that would be starting off with the definition of configuration management taken directly from the Drupal 8 documentation. In Drupal, configuration is the collection of admin settings that determine how the site functions, as opposed to the content of the site. So we're going to dive into that, unpack that a little bit more, because based on that statement, you're probably like, okay, I kind of get what you're saying, but what are you saying? So what is configuration? Let's start there. And it's more of a question of what isn't configuration than what is, right? So the definition from Drupal.org clearly states it's a set of configuration that builds your site, and it's not content related. So in this table, you see what is considered configuration and what isn't considered configuration. So content types are configuration. The actual nodes, the content itself, is not. Taxonomy vocabularies is. Taxonomy terms are not. Menus are. Menu links are not. Blocks are. Block content, I know in your head you're like, blocks and block content, aren't those the same thing? Block content is not. Media types, kind of like content types, are. The media itself is not. Also, side note here on helpful module. We aren't talking about this module today, but if you have to do config management with blocks, you should look at the recreate block content module. Basically, what that module does is it gives you an empty block to preserve where the block is positioned within your Drupal site, because that's not necessarily preserved. So basically you run after you install that module, done your config export and import, you run cache clear, and that module goes through and kind of adds empty blocks where you should have blocks in your site. The content itself will have to be moved over, but the block itself is recreated. So our workflow here, this workflow is actually based on Pantheon's workflow. If you've ever worked with Pantheon, essentially they have a code moves up, content moves down sort of architecture. So the idea here is you would start developing code on dev, you'd move that to test, your content would live on live, you'd move that live content down to test, down to dev. So that way your site is in sync in all stages. So, and just to clarify, code is source files, Drupal core, modules, configuration. Content is items in your database, and files uploaded through Drupal. So your media assets, as we talked about. Other types of configuration, fields have configuration, views have configuration, display modes, image styles, language settings. A lot of configuration comes when you translate a site or set a site to be multilingual. System settings, user roles, and then modules. Each module can have its own configuration as well that goes along with it. This is not an exhaustive list, but it just covers some of the high level items you can expect. So where's the configuration stored? This is important to understand because it helps with essentially understanding the difference between active configuration and stored configuration. We're going to talk about that a little bit right now. Active configuration is the configuration that is stored in the Drupal database. That is the configuration that your site is using actively when you go to your site. When you make a change through the Drupal UI, the changes appear immediately in Drupal. That means that that's active. Some benefits to this, as listed on Drupal.org, are performance and security. So active configuration is the configuration that your Drupal site is currently using. Now, compare that to staged configuration. That's configuration that's stored in, exported and stored in YAML files in the file system. So when you do a config export, that's basically taking active configuration and exporting it to the staged configuration. Changes are applied to Drupal when you do an import. So when you import your staged configuration, the staged configuration is then replacing the active configuration. Benefits here, portability, again, security. And there are modules that can allow for better handling of your active configuration and your stage configuration. And actually, to be fair, Drupal core does a great job of giving you kind of a diff of active and staged communication, or configuration rather. We are going to see that as we get into the demo in a couple of slides here with the configuration manager. So the configuration manager, this is Drupal core's way of handling configuration. So it's, as I said, it's in core. You have the ability through the configuration manager to import and export single set of configuration, or you can actually export the whole site, the configuration from the whole site. It does allow for a better Drush integration as well. As I said before, we started the webinar today. I was talking to some folks on the call, and we were talking about I prefer to use Drush because it's easier to work with the configuration with Drush. And today we'll look at both. We'll look at how it works through the UI and then how it works through Drush. But predominantly, I'll be using the command line. So here you actually have the ability to do a comparison between your active and staged config. So here you'll see in this screenshot that we have some changes to our configuration. It tells you what's new, what's changing. And then you have the ability to see differences. So if we were to click this View Differences button here, you would see a screen that looks something like this. And you'll notice the terms active and staged. The active configuration is showing that the price list module was installed. The stage configuration does not have that. So that means that this site had the price list module installed on it, but nobody exported that configuration to the file system. So there's essentially, there's a difference here, right? If somebody were to do a config import to the staged configuration, that would overwrite the active configuration, effectively uninstalling the price list module. I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any questions on the active and staged configuration? Okay, I'm going to assume silence means no. Getting into some workflows for configuration. When you're using a configuration manager, configuration management in general with Drupal core, you have a very linear workflow. So basically all environments share the same set of configuration. And this is good for smaller sites and smaller organizations where, maybe many people aren't working on the same project, or, it's very, the changes are very few and far between. This workflow wouldn't necessarily be recommended for a larger site. Can get to a point where many people are working on it and then overwriting changes that are being made. So here we introduce config split and how that kind of helps that workflow. So again, if I go back one here or two, you'll notice, again, very linear. Here's your configuration going through your local dev, stage, and prod. Config split helps this with two configuration methods, and we'll talk about those. So essentially what config split does, let's talk about what config split does first and foremost. It's a contrib module. It allows you to split certain configuration and in two different ways, either completely splitting it or doing a partial split, a conditional split. And then essentially what this does is it allows you to define what configuration is loaded on what site. So as you'll see, once we get through the next couple of slides, I have a workflow slide where config split works on a common set of config that applies to all your sites, and then allows you to split out individual configs for those sites. So for example, if you wanted to use Views UI, actually, I think Laura before the call was talking about Views UI. You didn't want Views UI installed on your production environment. You could have your core common set of files that apply to all of your sites. And then in your production split, you could say, okay, don't install Views UI for this split. And then through your CI/CD pipeline, the site would get deployed. And it would say, hey, this is the production site. We're using a production split. Config import that split, and that would prevent Views UI from being installed. The great thing about config split is once it's configured, it actually works the same way as core configuration. You can use your config import, config export commands. And it has, as you can see here, it does have a little bit of an admin UI that you can look at to see, what split is active and so on and so forth. Again, once we get into the demos, we'll be looking at configuring config split and then enabling certain splits, disabling other splits. But first, let's jump into a complete split and a conditional split. So a complete split is basically that configuration is being removed from the common directory and only applies to the split or the environment that you've that you've established. And we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about environmental splits versus feature splits. But first things first, keep in mind that a complete split removes that configuration from your common folder. So that's not going to apply to all of your sites. It's only going to apply to the site you have it configured for. As where a conditional split allows you to keep the configuration in the common folder, apply it to all of your splits or environments, depending on how you have your site set up. But then change the configuration per environment. So a good example I like to use for a conditional split is you may have Google Analytics installed on all of your environments, but you may want to use a different ID for the lower environments. So that way you can still do some testing, still configure things, but then you don't have that testing messing up your production environment. You can set a conditional split to say install Google Analytics on all my environments, and then set the split to say change the Google ID for dev stage, and then use this ID for production. And we'll get into that when we get into our demos. So here you see the configuration screen for a conditional split. You have the ability also, I believe, with the conditional split to split out specific entries in the configuration as well. So if there was just one line in the configuration file you wanted to split out, you could do that too. Admittedly, I don't have a ton of experience with that, because usually we just use a conditional split out the whole config file as opposed to just one line in it. So there's a question in the chat room: do we need a specific version of Drush to support config management? No, you need the version of Drush that works with your version of Drupal, but no. Config management has worked with Drush since Drupal 8. So here's a diagram of the workflow for an environment-based workflow. Now, an environment-based workflow versus a feature-based workflow. Your environment-based workflow is obviously going to be a split per environment. A feature-based workflow is going to work with a split for a certain feature, and then you can kind of pile those features on top of each other for certain environments or certain deployment steps. But the key thing to take away here is, again, remember our workflow for core being very linear. It's literally from dev or from local to dev to stage to prod. Here we have one common configuration that applies to all the environments, but then we have the ability to have configuration that is layered on top of those for local, for dev, for stage, and for prod. Another example of this is something I like to do on our projects at Oomph, is that when we start a project, I typically will change the site name to include the environment or the configuration split that is currently active, because that way I can look right in the tab and go, oh, I'm on the local split right now. Okay, cool. Do my thing and export the config. Or if I need to test something on the production split, I can load that split and I'll be able to see right in the tab, oh, okay, I'm on the right split because this says production. So just a useful tip for you folks out there. And then you look at a feature workflow. So a feature workflow here, you can see that instead of splitting into environments, we're splitting into features. So a Devel split, a Fastly split, a Solar split, a Redis split. We're going to show some folder structure and some commands settings.php configuration that kind of highlights these a little bit more. But essentially, you can layer these on top of each other. So, for example, if you didn't want Solar or Fastly to load for your dev environment, you could say, hey, load the devel split, and then leave the Fastly and Solar splits off until you get to your production environment. Let's jump in. Let's look at the configuration there. So here you actually have a folder directory, okay? And this shows you what the folder structure is for each of these types of workflows. So environmentally, you have a config folder. Inside that config folder, you have your common configuration. Then you have your dev, local, prod, and stage folders. In a feature split, again, you have that config folder, but you have your devel, Fastly, stage file proxy, and sync directory. The sync directory is actually synonymous with the common directory for in those examples. So where we're using common for the environment, that is the config that applies to everything. The same thing is true here with the sync directory. That applies to everything. And then how do you configure settings.php? So you can see here for the environment split, we have a switch case statement in place here to say, hey, what environment is it? Switch based on that. In our example today, we're actually just going to use the lines of code, the config line there with true and false. In this example, it's actually funny that they all say true. I would actually say that in this example, they should all say false, and one of them should say true. But you get an idea here of an environment split versus a feature split and how you would turn on or off one split versus another. Before I get into configure read-only, any questions with those two workflows or anything else that I've spoken to this point?
I am Joanne. Hi there, John. And I am typing up a question for you so I could be clear, but here it is since you asked. I'm wondering how config fits into this scenario. So, I've sat in on config stuff and I understand that, we're exporting it's replacement for features, right? And more, I'm sure. I haven't actually developed with it, but so if I'm creating a site and I want it to be a base site and it excludes content, but it includes custom theming, modules, config modules, maybe custom modules, content types that I've created, it's set up, but it's empty of content. Is config the right way to, you might say, clone it so that it could be used as a starter, much like a distribution?
No, so config is specific to the site that it originated on. That's a great question. So you can't use config from one site on another site without having to jump through some hoops. So I won't say it's impossible because it's not, but essentially what happens is your site ID is associated with the configuration that is exported. And that's on purpose. So that way, when that config goes from dev to stage or from local to dev to stage to prod, it can ensure that that config belongs to that site. You can take config and use it on another site, but you would have to go through a process of changing that site ID to match whatever the site ID is of the site you're installing it on. So it can be done. I don't know if I would necessarily use it as a distribution, so to speak, but you could use it as a starting point for an organization if you wanted to. Yeah.
Yet it is used for features, so it's a replacement for features. And with features, you are able to create something on one site and create a feature and put it on wherever you want.
Right, yeah. So I mean, essentially features packages things up as like modules. So you're basically turning the module off, turning the module on. And that's where, you know, configuration management is a little bit different because it's baked into core. It's more based on the site that you are you're working on. So, you know, as I said, you could do it that way. There have been instances where I know at Oomph we had basically a starting point where we used a base installation of configuration. So it's definitely possible. But I would just, you know, I would be very, very careful about doing that and be sure that you're not just going to be able to take your config folder from one site, drop it into another site and do a config import and everything's going to work. You're going to, if you do that, you're going to get an error that's usually related to the site ID not matching up.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's jump into config read only, and we're going to talk about config ignore, and then we're going to get into some live demos. And I'm pretty good on time, so I'm excited about that. There's going to be plenty of time at the end to ask questions as well, so get the questions ready. So config read only. Config read only is a great module, especially if you like to make sure that clients or site users aren't doing anything on the production site that they shouldn't be. So one of the big use cases for configuration management is that it allows you to basically store site config and then test it and deploy it, which is really you know, a hallmark of scalability and reliability, right? So, you know, I know at Oomph, we have a rigorous code review process that includes reviewing any changes to configuration, obviously. And, you know, one thing that can happen is config can change in production. You know, the addition of a menu, for example, somebody adds a menu to the sidebar of a page. Well, you've now created menu configuration, block configuration that isn't in the repo or on a lower environment. So config read only is a module that you can enable that will prevent any configuration changes from taking place. And essentially what it does is it just pops up a message, as you can see right here, and says, hey, this form's not going to be saved because you know, config read only is installed and it's the active configuration is in read only mode. Now, this is great for preventing people from making changes to the config on a production site. You know, it does take a little bit of education in the client sense, where you have to tell your client like, hey, listen, if you see this message, you're trying to change config. So you're going to talk to us and we'll figure out a way, if you really need to edit it, a way that you can edit it, which we're going to talk about config ignore in a minute. Or we can just do it and push it up on our normal deployment day or through our normal CI pipeline. I will say, make sure you have a solid CI pipeline in place with automated testing to ensure that no rogue configuration gets sent to production, because this module will prevent you from changing configuration. So if a rogue piece of config gets up there, Kirsten says rogue config is bad. Yes, it is. We do not like rogue config. But if it gets up to your production site, it could prevent you from getting the site back up as quickly as possible or resolving the issue as quickly as possible, because it would either require another deploy or for you to SSH into the server. And depending on how the module is configured, you can configure the module to allow for command line access, or you can configure it to not allow for command line access. So depending on how secure you are, it can work against you. So bottom line, make sure your CI and your testing pipeline is strong. And yeah, Laura is definitely right in the chat room. You have to think about the fix scenario. Like, hey, if this happens, what do we do? Put a SOP in place to make sure that you have that situation figured out. But there's always an exception. Oh, we need to just get to this one thing. We find this actually a lot with web forms, where clients need to add or edit web forms, and web forms are stored in config. So typically what we'll do is we'll tell the client, hey, listen, we can give you the ability to edit web forms, add and edit web forms, but just be aware that those, if something goes wrong, those web forms could potentially be lost, right? So, typically we'll pull down config if we have this situation going on pretty regularly, but there's still that small chance that in between us pulling it down and so on and so forth, there could be an issue. So basically what config ignore does is it allows you to ignore certain config files. And essentially what that's going to do is that's going to allow your client to jump into it's going to prevent config from being overwritten when a deployment happens. So if you have config that has changed on production and it's ignored, then that's fine. It's just going to live on happily. There is another module, config read only, config ignore read only, I'm sorry, that integrates config ignore with config read only. And then that way you could say, hey, listen, we're going to config ignore web forms, and that's automatically going to allow for folks to add web forms to the site. Ignore that config, so that way you're not blowing those changes away when you make your deploy. Config ignore is pretty useful. You just have to know that that config, you can still export that config, but when you import it again, it's not going to update for you. Is config read only all or nothing, or can it be applied to specific types of config? Config read only is, I believe it is all or nothing, but with config ignore read only, you can tell it which configuration should be excluded from read only status. So they kind of work, those two modules work hand in hand to make it less all or nothing and more customizable.
John,
Yes.
we have two people who raised their hand. I see Stacy Pendle. Do you want to ask a question?
I was actually, that's a great catch, because I was looking at them and I think they still have their hand up from when I asked my initial question of who's using config management, but I could be completely wrong. So Stacy or Jim, if you have a question, jump right in. No? Okay. I think they may be good. Okay, well, you know what? That's actually a great segue into my next slide, which is a big old thank you slide. At this point, again, if anybody has any questions, jump in and feel free to ask them. And I'm actually going to put in about a 5-minute break right here. So if you want to go grab a drink or something, you can do that. And then I'll come back at, I'm going to round up. It's going to be a 6-minute break. We'll come back at 3:15 Eastern, and we'll continue with some live demos. If anybody has any questions in the meantime, feel free to jump in and just shout them out.
So I have a question. I have not used the feature way of configuring, but doing it that way, would it cause, because you always have new features, could that be more cumbersome and hard to manage than just managing it by the environment?
So there are mixed schools of thought on this. And what I mean by that are, either way, you have to be really, really aware of how you're structuring things. If you had a site with 30 modules installed on it, and each one of those were broken out into its own feature configuration, then yeah, that could probably get a little bit unmanageable, unless you had a really strong workflow of how you were managing that. But I think it really depends on your use case. Where the feature config split makes a lot of sense is where you may have um, different needs for different environments. So, for example, if you were using say you're using solar only on your production server, the other servers didn't have solar for some reason. You could install all your solar specific modules. You could set a feature for solar and have that be installed on your production environment during your CI pipeline process, as opposed to Devel's also another great example. Like that's a good use case for a feature config setup where, I'm going to put Devel here, here, and here. At Oomph, we usually go with an environment-based configuration workflow, just because that's typically how our clients' hosting environments are set up, usually working with Pantheon or Acquia, where we have, a dev, test, and production environment. We're all locally working on Lando, so, we have that local split as well. And then, I think it's really, again, I think it's really based on what your scenario is, and then just making sure you're planning appropriately. You'd want to make sure you're thinking of scalability and longevity, because you might start off with like, oh, we have like 3 feature splits, great, and then by a year down the road you might have 10. Okay, still not really a big deal. But like another year down the road, if you have like 35 or 40 or 50, now your settings file is like 6 miles long, and you're like, oh, did I turn this one off? Did I turn that one off? Did I turn this one on? So yeah, you definitely want to think that through.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's see here. Live demo portion of our show. It's always a fun one. So I don't know if anybody else can hear that, but I think my son's downstairs playing with Hulk. So at any given point in time, I forgot to the caveats at the beginning of the show here. At any point in time, he could come in and offer up his opinions on config management, how that all works.
That's the COVID life, blending work.
It is. It's true. Actually, I did a talk for a marketing group last month or the month before, and it was about presentation tips. And one of them was like just kind of rolling with the interruptions. Like the garbage truck goes by, the dog is bothering you, the kids are running in. We all remember the guy from I think it was the BBC, who was interrupted by his kids and the nanny. Like, hey, it's gonna happen. Just roll with it, folks. Just roll with it. Okay, so let's see here. We got about another minute here. Wow, that 6 minutes went by real fast. Let me resume sharing. Do you guys see my command line?
Yes, it's right beside
cool. Yep. And then there's a browser window. And I'm just realizing that we actually are going to need a code editor too.
Hey, John, if you're able to, can you make the text slightly bigger on all of them? Because it's like itty bitty tiny now with 3 side by side.
Super small. Okay, yeah, we can definitely do that. Let me what we'll do is I'll actually make this one a little bit bigger for the time being, and then we'll pull these up in front. Let's see if this works.
That is good.
Cool. All right, let me see if I can do that here though.
Are you using? Yep, I termed it. And you're
Great.
using Lando.
I am using Lando. Yes.
I like Lando. It's snarky.
It does provide a certain level of snark. Yes. So let me jump back in here, and yeah, that's a great point. My local setup here is just I'm using Lando with the Drupal recommended project, and this is just a base Drupal install, nothing special other than Drupal special, right? So we're starting from scratch here. So what we're going to do, again, just to kind of run through it quickly, is we are going to work through setting up config management from just a base Drupal install. We're going to go through the UI, what the UI looks like, how you can export and import through the UI, and then we're going to talk about export import through through Drush. And then we're going to work through installing a module and looking at some if we change configuration, what that looks like. And then from that, we're going to go into setting up and configuring config split. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we have a successful live demo. So we'll see how that goes. So first things first, let's jump into configuration management in the UI, right? So let's pull this over here. This is Drupal. I'm sure everybody's familiar. We have this configuration tab up the top here. Pretty straightforward. And you've actually already seen this because there was a visual in my slide deck. But if we go down to configuration synchronization here, you'll notice that we don't have any config to synchronize, which is fine for right now. We'll get into this screen and how it changes as we work. But the more important tabs here are the import export tabs and what is possible through those tabs. So let's do import first. Here you can import a full archive of your site. So basically, this is a tar file, zip file that you can drop in here, and it will unpack it and apply that that configuration to your site. You also have the ability to import a single item, and that's more of a copy and paste sort of workflow where you're going to select the type of configuration. So here we'll go to views, and then you would paste the views configuration in here and import it, and this would import it into your active configuration. On the export here, again, you have full export. You hit this, you get gzip file with all of your config for your whole site. If you do a single item, now I will say, I'm going to pause for a second here. The single item export is actually super helpful when you are trying to configure config ignore. Because it'll give you an idea of the configuration that you may want to put into, or the names of the files, or the specific lines, because you can actually do specific lines for config ignore that you may want to add. So if you look in here, you're going to get that same sort of list of config items. And let's see, let's go actually with simple configuration. If we look at this and we go into system site, you can see here that this is the configuration for this site, right? The site name, the mail address. If I had 403 and 404 pages set up, this would be there. And you'll be able to see how this changes as we start working. We can use this file as an example, but essentially, this is super helpful if you're trying to figure out, like, oh, I want to config ignore the 304 page, or sorry, 403 page. You can go in and say, oh, page 403, don't overwrite that ever. And it's this interface is actually super helpful. So it's a quick overview of the UI there. Nothing overly complicated going on here. And like I said, typically the synchronized page is the one that you're using the most. The import export features are usually done via Drush. So let's jump into getting configuration and kind of doing our first export of configuration. So first things first, if you look at your settings.php file, you'll notice that it has this config sync directory set up. And this config sync directory is actually set to be in your files folder, and it has this big long hash to it and has a sync directory at the end of it. Our preferred method for this is actually to take it out of the files directory and change this all together to something much more manageable. So essentially, we're going to pull this out of here, and we're going to change it to go up one directory, look in the config folder, and then jump into the common folder. Problem with that is those folders don't exist. So let's quickly create those. So I'm going to make a directory. And nobody make fun of my command line foibles, if you will. It's been a little while since I've been jumping into this full time. So we're gonna make another direct. Oh, somebody's joining. It's a fun side note for you. Everybody's listening. They don't realize this, but every time somebody joins, it takes focus away from my screen. So. Okay, so now you can see we have a config folder. Inside our config folder is our common folder. I'm going to save this. Yes, override it. Do what I told you to do. Thank you for protecting me against myself. So now, we're all set. We have our config ready to be exported to the place that we said. Now, we can go ahead and do that. Easy enough. So if I do a Lando Drush CEX, I'm actually going to do the full command for the first time, just so you can see it. Config export. So config export shortens down to CEX. I'm going to use CEX for the rest of this because config export's more letters, but I want to make sure everybody understands what the full Drush command looks like. I do that, and it works and works and works and works and works. Should have gotten music. There we go. So now you can see, hey, your config was successfully exported to this folder. So if I go here, hey, it didn't put it into the config folder, which is good. If I change into the common folder here, hey, look, there is all my configuration and all its wonderfulness. So there it is. You can see every piece of configuration that makes up our site. If we go back into the UI and we refresh this page, we should see no changes. And we don't. Perfect. So that's it. You just exported config for your site. That's awesome. You can commit that to your repo. Send it up for a code review. Send it out to servers. Your other servers, your production, your stage server. You can do whatever you want with it. At this stage, that's kind of useful, right? Well, let's get into it a little bit deeper here, and let's look at installing one of our favorite modules and see what that looks like. So I'm going to do a Lando composer require Drupal admin toolbar. Did I mean composer? Yes, I did. I definitely spelled that wrong, huh? Let's try that again. There we go. Yes, I do want to use that one. Thank you for asking. So we're going to pull that, and oh, you know what? Yeah, I already probably had it in there, which is good. So if I go into extend now, I know I could do this through Drush and just enable that module, but I want to enable a couple modules, and it's easier at this point to look at the UI and do it from here. So we're going to install those modules. Hopefully we don't receive a white screen of death. Fingers crossed. This is fun. So Docker plus Lando plus Zoom is plus a camera is taxing. Hey, look, admin menus. Now we can get to things easier. That's amazing, right? Okay, so here on the synchronized screen, we see some things have changed. One is the core extensions file, which if you're not familiar, core extensions is basically where all your modules, if they're enabled, are stored. So you can see here, very similar to the screenshot in my presentation, our active config includes the admin toolbar search, and admin toolbar tools. That is not in our staged config, which if you remember is because we haven't exported it to the file system yet. So if I were to go ahead and do a config import, it would blow away admin toolbar and go back to kind of my default state of Drupal. You'll also see that there is a file being removed, which, you know what's interesting? That's probably being removed because I had used this environment previously to test my presentation. So you can see here, this is active and it has all the config for the toolbar, and then staged, we don't have that file in our stage yet. So we can do another config export here, and it will export our configuration. But let's do the opposite first, and let's do a config import. So again, Lando Drush config import. Say we made a mistake. Oh, hey, we didn't install admin toolbar right. You could go Lando Drush config import. In the future, this will be Lando Drush CIM. And if I do that, it's going to say, hey, you're about to do this thing, which is get rid of all this config. Yep, so I'm going to update that. I'm going to delete that file, right? Okay, yes, go ahead. We'll notice now that once this is done, admin toolbar sadly has gone away. Whoop, synchronize. And this is the nice thing right here about config sync, especially through the command line. It'll tell you everything that it's doing. So you can actually see when we get into config split, you'll actually see when you switch splits, you'll see it installing modules specific to that split, which is nice. Kind of validates the fact that you're in the right split. So if I refresh this, all of this stuff's going to go away. Here we go. And you'll notice that now config admin toolbar is not installed, which makes me sad. So very quickly, I'm going to go install that again. So we have it because it makes our lives way easier. And then we will actually export it to our configuration. So the next time we do an import, if need be, we don't lose it. While I'm doing this, are there any questions out there that I can answer? I got one in the chat. I will read it in just a second. So in the use case for feature-based primarily, if you have different configuration settings in each module for the same module, you need to use feature-based. If you just want a module to be on or off by environment, then you would use the environment-based split. No, so feature-based is solely based on if you want that feature added to your environment. Environment-based is like dev prod, stage. If you so with the addition of config split into the environment-based workflow, you'd be able to actually enable or disable those features based on the environment. then how do you define feature? So a feature would be, if you remember my slide, a feature would be something like devel, for example, right? So devel is a module. You know, a feature is really just like an additional module or service that you want to install. So if you had, you know, Solar is another great example. You know, you may not want to install Solar on your local if you're not specifically working with Solar. So you would say like, okay, for my local environment, I'm only going to enable, you know, my core set of files, and then my devel and not Solar, just to save kind of that load time. Hopefully that answers your question, Adam. I don't know if it does. So this import removed the last config that came when you installed the module. Yes, it did. So if you do a config import and your config isn't staged, remember, config import is taking what's staged and making it active. So if I didn't export the config, which is taking the active and saving it to the staged environment or the file system, then if I do an import, yeah, it's going to remove that. It's going to remove those installed modules. But we have them reinstalled now. So I am actually going to do a Lando Drush config export. And it's going to show me what it's going to export, which should be our core extensions file and the admin toolbar configuration file. Right, there it is. I want to do yes. All right, so you can see our config is successfully exported. If I go back to my synchronization page, there should be nothing there. And now if I do a config import, admin menu will be enabled and active no matter what, unless I remove it from my configuration. Any other questions I can answer there? The next thing that we're going to jump into is config split and getting that up and running. So this is basically, you know, basic configuration management in core here. It's, you know, import, export, making changes. We can, if it's helpful, I'm more than happy to do one more change here. You know, we can do something as simple as looking at our performance. Change our cache time, save configuration. Does this support multi-site too? Well, somebody else asked about multi-site, I think, and I saw it and I didn't answer it. So, oh, it was you. Okay, well, Virginia, I'm going to answer it right now. Multi-site, yes, you can build configuration management for multi-site. So it ends up being like three-dimensional chess, which I know sounds super complicated, but essentially then what you're doing is your config folder. So the way we have our config folder set up right now, let me back out a little bit. So we have common here, right? So your config folder in this instance would look a little bit differently, because I think inside your config folder, you would then want a configuration folder for each site you were doing as part of your multi-site, which then your settings file would have obviously those different directories in there. So, you know, we can, let's spec that out a little bit, right? So if I made make directory site 1, right? Make directory site 2, there we go. So like you would end up getting rid of the common folder. I'm not going to do that because that would cause issues, but imagine common's not there. And then site 1, site 2, those are your sites. Inside that, then you could have your common folder, right? And then as you set up config split, you could have different splits within that. So yeah, you could definitely use this with multi-site, but it's like I said, three-dimensional chess. You want to just make sure that you are thinking about how you're setting it up and doing a lot of testing to make sure that you aren't breaking things. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so we've updated our we updated our performance settings. We added a cache. You know, I talked about you know, system sites, basic site settings, adding like a different label here. Changing our site title, something here, save configuration. So I've made all these changes to the active configuration, right? I've made them in the database. They are not saved to the file system. We can see that if we go back to our configuration synchronization page. Hey, there are the 2 changes that I made. Yep. We know that those are in there. I'm going to blow away those changes because I don't really want to take them with me down the road. So to do that, I can simply go Lando, Drush, CIM, which is config import. Now, again, it's going to take, I'm going to show a visual here because everything's better with visuals. It's going to take that staged config and overwrite the active config. So it's going to reset everything. If I wanted to take the active config and have it be my staged config, I would do an export here. So I change that to an export, but I'm going to do an import. And then I'm going to answer one more question, and then we're going to jump into config split. So let me do that. While that's working, what does the message in synchronization section mean? The following configuration entities are ignored due to the config ignore settings, and therefore not displayed in the list above. In the action column, some items are being created, some updated, others deleted. Is this bad? Should I import all? So essentially what's happening is that's just Drupal's way of telling you like, hey, there's certain config that's being ignored here. So you're not seeing it. And that configuration, nothing's going to change with that configuration because you have config ignored set up. If time permits towards the end and everybody wants to do it, I might be able to get config ignore installed, and we can kind of play around with it, but I am making no promises. So we're going to do that. Okay, we're back to where we want to be. So if you do this, there we go. All right. So config split. Config split does take a little bit to set up, but once it's set up, it's pretty easy to work with. Once you kind of understand the principles and the things that are going on. So first and foremost, we're gonna do a Lando composer. I'm actually just gonna copy this so I get all the names right. And I'm actually gonna extend this a little bit so that way we can see the whole line. There we go, look at that. So basically we're installing config split, and then they recommend chosen and select two, which basically help the config split UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download these rather. And then what we'll do is, oh no. Okay, well, this is why live demos are dangerous, folks. We're just going to erase that last one. Kirsten says that looks red, but I think she meant that looks rad, right? Right, am I right? Yeah, always, yep, got it. Okay, so we got what we need here. So as I was saying, the two additional modules, or one additional module in this case, just make the UI a little bit better. And unfortunately, I think because we don't have, actually, I guess the select menus will be okay, but we'll see what the difference is. We're going to learn together today. It's going to be great. So I am going to actually enable config split from the command line because it's easier. And all of you know what the module enable screen looks like. So let's go ahead and enable config split. All right, so we have config split enabled. We are going to have to do some configuration both for config split, which you will now see in a second. So you'll see here we have core extensions set up. You'll see that config split is enabled. Perfect. Now, if we go into config split settings, we're actually going to have to set up each one of our splits. Now, I am doing an environment-based setup. The same steps are going to happen if you're doing a feature-based setup. I'm just doing environment-based because, like I said, that's usually the way we do it at Oomph. But you can take this and use a feature-based setup very easily. So let's add one. And we're going to call this dev. And my folder is going to be config dev. Now, mind you, they're not set up. This active checkbox, we're going to shut that off. We don't want any of these to be active. I'm also not going to add any complete splits or conditional splits right now. We'll come back and do that. I'm just going to save these. It's going to tell me that it doesn't exist, which is fine. You know what we'll do? We'll go in and create the folders first, and then we won't get that error anymore. So let's do. So here we're going to make directory dev, make directory prod, and we'll make a stage 2 just so we get the full experience. We might not actually use it, but we'll see. Okay, so we got that. Let's add those other 2 folders here. So prod, until I've done this before. You know what's interesting? I think on the previous one, I only did prod and dev. You know what? We'll go with prod and dev, because if you can do it for 2, you can do it for 3. Okay, so we have our 2 folders set up here. They're both inactive. That's the way we want this, because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to actually turn on which split is active via the settings.php file. So let me jump into that really quick, and you can see it. And let me jump to the questions, because a few of them came in. So Eric's cautioning me against chosen in certain themes. Thank you for that. And then Laura's asking about making one for local. So if I was working locally, yeah, I'm definitely going to turn one of them on. And actually, you know what? Why don't we do that? Why don't we make a local split, and then that way you can get live experience here. Locale. Okay. Local. There we go. And actually, Laura, to clarify, I would not leave it active. Again, it's going to be active made by your settings.php file, not by the actual configuration. So let's get to that setup. In here, I'm copy and pasting again to avoid any sort of issues with. All right, so config split, my split, your split is going to be replaced with dev. Status is true. Actually, let's do local here. Local, true. Let me copy this a couple times. Dev, prod, false, false. Okay, now I'm going to save this, overwrite, and very important to remember when you are doing any switching between splits, you have to clear the cache. Once you change your settings.php file, be sure to clear the cache and then do your import, or it's not going to work very well. Before I do that, I'm going to refresh this page, and now you'll see that my local split is active, overwritten. That just means, hey, it's being overwritten from settings.php. That's what we want. That's perfect. And now I'm actually going to do a Lando Drush config export. Can anybody tell me why I'm doing a config export? I know I turned it on you guys unfairly. Basically, I'm doing a config export because I just made a whole ton of changes to my active config, and I want to make sure I don't lose them. And we don't have any splits configured yet, so all of this config is going to go right into that common folder. So let me jump in there and do that. We can see each one of our splits is getting configured. The modules are getting configured. Yes, we're going to do that. Okay. Now we're in a safe space. We've saved all of our, or exported all of our configuration. Everything is good. If we go back to our synchronization screen, everything should be clean. Should be nothing on there, hopefully. Yes. Okay. Now we have the ability to start configuring our splits. So we can go through and do that. I think one of the easiest things to illustrate this, what I'll do is I'll do some configuration and then I'll actually install a module, and we'll see how that goes. But I think the easiest thing here is to show you, again, the idea of doing a split with our basic site settings. So first and foremost, let me go in and configure this split to the way I want it. So if I come into edit, and I'm not going to do a complete split, I'm going to conditional split. Now, here's where the chosen and select to modules come in. This list, actually in Drupal 8 used to didn't have checkboxes. It used to be a select list. Recently, with Drupal 9, they added a patch to make this list of checkboxes, which is nice. With chosen, it gives you the ability to kind of search through this list and makes it a little bit easier to find the things that you're looking for when you're kind of going through here to select things. So I'll do this one the painful way, and then I will go in and enable that, and you can see how it changes. So system site is going to be my conditional split here because I'm going to make changes in system site that I want to only apply to this site. So I'm going to save those. And I'm actually going to do that for all of these except for production, because production is going to have our original site title we want. And everybody's looking at me like, does he not know how to spell system site? I do, I really do. It's just fast scrolling, trying to be efficient with time. Okay, so those have all been saved. Let's go in here and see if I did this right. So if I go into system site, I am going to change this to say local. Let's save that. And did it work? Yep, sure did. Cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a config export. Save that change. We're going to look to see where that change gets saved out. you can see here they have the splits and the system site change being saved. Okay, so it was saved to common. Let's look in here. And if I go into my dev directory here, oh, there's nothing there. I might have messed this up. We will see. So let's go to, let's go and do a switch. Let's switch our splits here. So let's go into our dev split. And that's the switch. We're switching, and then we're going to do a Lando Drush CR and a Lando Drush CIM rather. So basically, this is just going to clear cache and do a config import for configuration that's in the dev split, which there should not be any changes. I think my misstep there was I should have exported the config before I made the change, but we'll see. Actually, that might have worked just fine. Okay, cool. So let's go back into here, refresh. Hey, look at that. It actually worked just fine. So let's go into here. We're going to add dev here. Man, typing is hard. I'm going to save this. And we're going to do a Lando Drush export. And now you'll see in our dev folder here, we have a system site file. And if I go into that system site file, let me open this up. You'll notice that the difference here is it has dev. If I were to open the one in the common folder, which I can do. Try again. You'll notice our common does not have that dev tag in it. So again, remember, common's being loaded and then whatever's in your split is being layered on top of it, okay? So we'll close those, we'll close that, we'll go back over here. Now let's go back to our local split and see if I got that one right, because I don't know that I did, but we will test it out. And then as you get into this, you can start using, Control Z to kind of get back and forth between the splits too, because you've made the changes and you're just going back and forth in the files. So Lando Drush CR, which is just a cache rebuild. And then here we're just, again, rebuilding the cache, importing that split to make sure that we have the correct files. Now, I anticipate that this will actually remove dev and not add local, but I could be pleasantly surprised. Oh, you know what? I think I was in the wrong folder before. Again, the troubles and tribulations of doing live demos. It's okay. Here we go. So if we refresh this, we should see local. Hey, and we do. Okay, perfect. So I mean, like that simple flag just gives you an idea like, hey, I now know what split I'm working on, what environment I'm in, and where my changes, if I do it, are gonna land. Let's look at something a little more complicated. And what I mean by that is, let's switch to our dev split and do a complete split for develop. So let's see, what does that look like? That looks like, let's go in here and we're gonna let's type it. And while I'm doing this, this is kind of a little bit repetitive. You guys have seen this all again, but if there are any questions, feel free to ask or to drop them in the chat there. Mhm. Okay, we're now in our dev split. I can verify that by, I can just reload this page or go to a different page. It'll say dev up here. And there it is. It actually even says it right here too. Hey, you're using the dev split. So that's super helpful. All right, so let's do a complete split. So what I want to do here is I want to go into my split settings. Oh, you know what I'm going to do before I do this? I'm actually going to go in here and install Chosen. So that way we can see the UI difference. I'll go with that. We'll see. Hopefully this doesn't break everything. It's one of those fun things where, you know, it worked earlier in the week, but it's a live demo. You never know. All right, let's go in and look at our config split settings here. So for dev, we're going to go in, we're going to edit those. You scroll down, hey, look at that. There's a much nicer configuration here. So this is interesting. So essentially, we're looking at a list of modules installed, but the problem we are having here is that we don't actually have, I don't know what that down arrow is. Looks like Chosen has busted my my ability to do configuration here, but
What
we
you
don't have
could do
develop.
is hit a command and just press them all.
Oh, so you'll notice we actually don't have devel here, and I am actually going to, I think I can select them. Yeah, I can still select them. So this is like actually more like the old way that it was, where you had to hold command and select them. Then they added the checkboxes. So the chosen module here is obviously not working out, but that's all right. You know why? Because I can just go Lando, Drush, config import, and just for good measure, I'm actually going to do a cache clear after that. And it'll go away and we don't have to talk about it ever again. And then after we do that, I'm going to actually install devel because we don't have it installed yet. Yes. You can see here in just this example how it's nice to be using config management, because you can go down a path of testing something or doing R&D on something, realize that path is not going to work out for you, and then very quickly get back to the beginning of the path and start over. So it definitely helps with your development flow of you know, failing fast. Okay, let's get devel in here. So I will say complete splits with modules is a little wonky sometimes, where you have to have the module enabled in order to do a complete split on it. So you'll see if I refresh this page right now, Devel probably isn't going to show up in that list because the module isn't actually enabled, unless that has changed in Drupal 9, which is possible. So let's see, let's go through the list here. No, Devel is not in there. I'll just double check because in previous versions of Drupal, this list also wasn't in alphabetical order. All right, so let's go in and enable that. So we might get into an instance here where we have to enable it, set up the split, and then install. All right, so we got Devel. Let's go back in and split it out here for us. And we're going to do a complete split because, again, we don't want this in our common config. We just want it stored in our development branch. So we're going to do a complete split on that. Save it. Good. And then we're going to do a config export. Lando, Drush, config export.
So quick question while that
Sure.
runs.
Yep.
So just to make sure I'm following correctly, if we only say wanted to turn on in local, then we would enable it in local.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So I can actually show you that. I can show you that next. Let me actually, I'll enable it for local as well. And then I'll just save out that config again, and then we'll have it in both places. So that's good, that's good. Let me run that again. Yeah, so essentially wherever you do the complete split, you will have that module in that module's configuration. And if I were using Git here, you'd be able to see the changes in the files, and within so you'll see here that the config split.local file has been updated. If I were to open that file, you would see that that file. Matter of fact, I can just open it. Config. So you'll see in this file, once it opens here, you'll see that it has modules, and Devel is outlined as one of the modules it's going to enable when this split runs. So again, taken out of common, taken out of the main configuration folder, and in this file, it's saying, hey, when this split is active, this module needs to be installed. Let's actually run through that, and we can all see how that's going to work. So let me actually go, I will switch to the production split real quick. And remember to clear cache. Nope, there we go. And as this runs, you're going to see a couple of different things going on here. One of which should be, if it's configured properly, uninstalling of Devel, and then the site name changing as well. Okay, so you see here, it's going to update our core extensions. It's going to change our site name. It's deleting all of the Devel related stuff, right? So let's do that. So here you can see it uninstalled Devel, it updated the system site, and then made sure everything was good to go. So if I come back here and I go to, let's actually just go to the system site basic settings. we're very quickly going to realize Devel is probably going to be removed from this menu. There it goes. Our site is basic config basic training. So that's the way we want it on prod. Now let's switch back to let's go into our local branch actually. And from there, we should see the exact opposite happen. Site's going to add the local tag, and then Devel should be installed. Maybe. So there's a question in the chat here. It says, anytime you change the settings file, you export. Why? Not clear to me. I'm not exporting, I'm importing. CIM is config import, CEX is config export. So anytime I change the settings file, I'm switching between a split. In order to enable that split, I have to clear cache and import the configuration. Because remember, from production, for example, from production to local, things are changing between those environment splits. So if I don't do an import, I'm not going to get the latest changes in that specific split. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So again, if I refresh this, we should see local appear here, Devel back up here. Hey, we do. Look at that. Okay, so a couple of use cases here, and I'm not going to actually go through the process of installing these. I'm just going to talk through them really quick, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Google Analytics, as I already said, a great use case here for a partial split or a conditional split. You know, your feature splits, again, could be something like Cloudflare, if you're using Cloudflare in production, Devel. Another good use case for environment-based splits is dlog and syslog. You know, most hosting providers recommend that you don't use dblog on a production site. So on a production site, you can switch syslog on, turn dblog off. And ultimately, you know, configuration management and config split have endless possibilities. You know, you can configure this in any way that makes sense for your use case. So, you know, it's really, you know, it's really up to you. Once you understand kind of the fundamentals that we've gone over in this training of how to switch splits, how to set up splits, how configuration management works, then you can really, you know, you can really craft it to whatever solution, to solve whatever solution you're trying to solve. At that point, at this point, I should say, I'm going to open it up for questions. Happy to kind of go over anything I've already gone over, or clarify anything I've gone over, or you know, jump into you know, a different area if need be.
I have one last quick question.
It doesn't have to be the last one, and it doesn't have to be quick. You can ask away.
Okay, so one thing I've been having trouble finding documentation on for this is files, especially when it's an external file server outside of Drupal. So I only really want that turned on prod because I get all kinds of permission errors on local. So I don't know if that's just a pure settings.php change, or is that something that is triggered here too? That would be easier.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? So are you looking to change like your file path?
Yeah, like not having the file path on local go to the one that's used for files on prod.
Sure. So that is, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a settings configuration.
Okay.
They changed away from like the path being stored in the database. So as you can see here, yeah, must be changed in settings.php. So that's definitely going to be a settings.php thing.
That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure if it also added a layer of complexity with all this. So thanks.
No, not really, because I mean, ultimately, you know, settings.php is gonna dictate which split you are using. It's going to dictate where your configuration is saved. If you're using it in a multi-site architecture, each multi-site is going to have its own settings.php. So it's going to kind of dictate where those configurations and splits are stored and configured. So, you know, settings.php is pretty useful and stores a lot of information for configuration management. So
Cool.
that's definitely a good place for the file stuff as well.
Cool. Thanks.
Question in the chat here, off-topic question. Now that you showed the easy way to move configuration, what is the easy way to bring content from prod to local? Oh, that is a great question. So there are like 8 million different ways that you could do that. I will talk about a couple of those 8 million ways. So depending on your hosting provider sometimes offers utilities within their management that allow for the easy moving of content. I know Acquia and Pantheon both provide kind of drag and drop solutions for moving databases from one environment to another. The other possibility is there are a set of modules. The name is escaping me right now, but there are a set of modules that will take your content and turn them into configuration, which basically just saves your content in YAML format. Feels a little icky to me. Another option is to use a static site generator like Tome to, again, take your content out of the database and save it in a file format. That way you can move it around as you need to. You know, Tome, I think, don't quote me, I think it allows for export into files and then import from files. So you could try to use that as kind of a workaround for the content conundrum. Kirsten saying that Sam was here in January and he did the January webinar. So you can go to the YouTube channel and watch that video and maybe he will answer that question for you. We've also had Sam on Talking Drupal to talk about Tome, and you know, he's great. Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Adam, the guy who asked about the environment versus feature base. I'm still not quite getting it. The example you used with solar, you were still stating it as you don't want solar on one environment, but you do want on the other environment. So to me, that means you would still use an environment-based approach because you would have your environment not have or have solar. So can you give me an example where it doesn't have anything to do with environment for features?
Yeah, I can. Let me, I'm actually going to go back and look at my slides really quick because the example we have in there is pretty good. So, you know, it really comes down to like features and enabling and disabling the features being at granular, right? The granular level of certain features being on and off, and what you want to test where, right? So regardless of the environment, right, whether it's local, dev, stage, or production, the idea with a feature-based workflow is the ability to turn certain features on and off no matter where you are. So, we use Solar or Fastly or Cloudflare with a development environment, or Devel with a dev or local environment. Again, all environment based, but it could very easily be something with, for example, for multi-site, where you want to use maybe you want to use one kind of core set of configuration, and you want to, for certain sites, you want to install or enable certain features. So, say you have one site using Solar and another site using Elasticsearch, right? Well, you'd have a feature set for Solar, you'd have a feature split for Solar, and a feature split for Elasticsearch, depending on which site you were running through the CI pipeline. You would say, oh, that split is true for this one, that split is false for this one. Like I said, there are a bunch of different ways that you can kind of mix and match environment-based versus feature-based. You just have to look at what makes the most sense for you and how you're using configuration management.
Okay, I think I get it now. Thank you.
Somebody in the chat. So Laura, I also miss my commute because I don't get to listen to as many podcasts. I'm going to take a little side venture down a side story here. For Christmas, my wife got me a Sonos One for my office. It has enabled me to start listening to podcasts again while I'm working. Recommend getting a speaker in your workspace if it's at all possible to solve the podcasting problem. Getting back on track here. Virginia asks, maybe some troubleshooting examples of some common sync issues. That's a great question. So essentially, the biggest sync issue I think that you can have is an issue where config is removed before it's ready to be removed. So the instance that you see a lot is installing a module. So imagine, again, I'm going with an environment-based workflow here, but imagine, you have a production environment. Well, you want to uninstall a module from production. So the logical, if you're doing this for the first time or you're very new to this, the logical step is, okay, uninstall the module, save the configuration, and then remove the module from your composer file, push that out. Well, a lot of times what happen is as you're building the site, the module will get removed, but the configuration hasn't been imported yet to uninstall the module. Your site then kind of blows up, or you have errors because you kind of did the uninstall backwards. So typically that turns into two commits. One is configuration update. Hey, we want to uninstall this module, clear cache. And then the second one is, hey, I'm gonna remove the file from Composer, the files from Composer, from the file system. So that's one instance. Another instance is missing configuration. Configuration sometimes relies on other configuration, and sometimes that can get, you can have an instance where, say, you're working on a team, one developer committed configuration, but forgot something or didn't think one piece was necessary. Gets up to the repo. Now, typically in your CI process, like if you're testing that before it gets into the main branch, it would say like, hey, I can't install configuration. There's an error here. Sometimes that doesn't happen though, depending on what your workflow is. So that could be another issue where config's missing or just wasn't pushed up to the repo. Virginia, anything specific that you're trying to overcome as far as troubleshooting goes, or is it just more of a general, like, I'm going to get into this, what am I going to run into? Well, I'm waiting for that response. I will say, I think one of the biggest things for our team when we started using config management on all of our projects was just getting in the right headspace of how config management works and what you need to do to switch a split or to do a complete split versus a conditional split. You know, those are the sorts of things that if you're new to config management, you want to get a you want to get a local up, and you just want to kind of play around with it a little bit and flip some levers, change some things, and see what works and what doesn't. Because once you get that, the workflow in your head, I think it definitely helps in making things a lot clearer as to like the steps and what you need to do and how to avoid those sync issues that you might run into. Any other questions? Okay, it doesn't sound like there are any others. I'll hang out for another 5-10 minutes if anything comes up. And if you have questions, you want to reach out, I'm on Drupal Slack, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Drupal.org. There are a number of different ways you can get a hold of me, so feel free to shout out if you have any questions. You're muted. I know, it's the worst.
Of course I'm muted. Thank you everybody for attending. I just want to say, give a reminder that next month's topic is Dev Panel, DevOps for AWS in March. And I know everybody on the East Coast, it's snowy, and so stay warm and safe.
Yes, luckily the internet and the power held out, so it's a plus.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.